Chuck, it's great to see you today.
Good to see you, Jason.
So, Chuck, you were squadron leader in the Navy SEALs, SEAL Team 6, and you're watching this war very carefully from the very first days. So, what are you seeing now? How are things going for the Russians in their invasion of Ukraine?
Well, the Russians seem to want to tell the world they're turning up the volume, and there are Russian social media posts showing increased deployments of materiel and men, primarily to the east, which is their focus of operations, but also now in the south. Over the last 24, 48 hours, there have been contact reports coming from the vicinity of Kharkiv, which is in the in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, and also, of course, continuing attacks in Kupiansk, Kremenna, Chasiv Yar, and notably Pokrovsk. So they seem to be pressing forward. Notice I didn't say advancing, because the Russians continue to lose 1,000 casualties a day. That's the equivalent of 2 battalions of infantry. Those losses are unsustainable. It's so often they lose 1,000. Analysts just shrug it off. But I want to remind our viewers that no nation in the world has ever won a war losing 360,000 troops a year. It just isn't going to happen.
So, it certainly does not seem like it's sustainable. And within Russia itself now, we see the TV ads asking people, do you need cash? Do you need a loan? Why don't you come join the military? We're always here for you. So they're just finding whoever is desperate for money to come join them. At this point, it looks more and more like it's a one-way mission whenever you choose to join up with the Russian army. But within the military itself, I see a lot more videos now of people doing things that don't make a lot of sense if you're trying to win a war, like parking their armed personnel carriers out in the open, in the middle of fields, with the hatches open. It seems to me that they're just trying to avoid the Ukrainian drones and don't really care if that means that their equipment is destroyed. Have you noticed that sort of a thing?
Yeah, absolutely. But these numbers hold that if 100 Russian vehicles are driven into contact with Ukraine, 38 of them are abandoned by the Russian crews. And, you are absolutely right to notice that these Russian vehicles, when they are abandoned in the field or deliberately parked in the open, vehicles that have not taken even the first measures of self-preservational camouflage, they inevitably are left with their hatches open. And that is so that Ukraine may more easily destroy them. And this doesn't just go at squad and company level. Last week, I reported in Point of Impact for the Kyiv Post, an S-300 missile complex was parked in the middle of a field in the wide open without a camouflage net, without one twig or leaf or branch put on it, and it was destroyed within about 80 minutes by the local Ukrainian artillery battery. It looks like people don't want to fight. And I think we also see that in these weekly, almost daily mutiny videos that are put on saying, "Dear Uncle Vlad, we're not getting food, we're not getting ammunition, we're not getting medical care. We haven't been rotated off the line since 2023. Do something about it." And as you know, in the military, you don't get to make a YouTube video. This is a mutinous assembly. And in circumstances of armed conflict, that's a capital offense.
It definitely does not seem like things are going very well. But it seems that's not just limited to the military. Within Russia itself, the situation is getting worse and worse. And what's amazing is that Ukraine's new strategy of avoiding an attritional war, avoiding the sort of war that Vladimir Putin would like to fight. Now, obviously, Russia is much bigger than Ukraine. And so being simply with more of a population, a greater population, it had assumed that it would just grind down Ukraine. But the Ukrainians are taking the war to Russia. And the strikes on the factories that produce Shahed drones, on the factories that produce very specific chemicals and parts needed by the military-industrial complex, seems to be working very well. Because within Russia, we see more and more chaos. We see more and more fear that things are not going the way that the Russians had hoped. And in fact, when I see that the Russians would like to have an air truce, it's really about that. They want to devoid Ukraine of the ability to attack Russia. It's not because they want peace. This is because they want to disadvantage the Ukrainians. Because the Russians, they're not doing very well within Russian territory. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, absolutely. And Ukrainians indigenously produced drones. I mean, many kind of underinformed analysts of the war will be saying things like, give Ukraine the weapons it needs to strike deep into Russia. Well, Ukraine has been doing that for about a year and a half now. They recently hit an oil refinery that was 1,500 kilometers from the zero line. So it is Ukraine striking deep, and generally any suggestion of a peace negotiation comes out of Putin's mouth or his chihuahua Lavrov. These are things that Russia needs. Russia needs, it needs an aerial truce because for the first time in history, Ukraine is using remotely operated vehicles to conduct a strategic bombing operation. It's incredible. But Ukraine has also made naval history, and I have a report coming up on the Kyiv Post here next week, just what Ukraine was able to do in the Black Sea against the Black Sea flotilla. Not only did they sink the Moskva, they completely rendered irrelevant all of Russia's quite deep amphibious warfare capabilities. You can't put one of those ships to sea anymore. They've sunk submarines. All of this is incredible, and Ukraine still does not have a single major surface combatant. So Russia is not winning. They are not winning. Do they continue to kill Ukrainian civilians every night? Right? That's their goal. But they're also burning through their own men, and it's starting to show they're running out of armor and they're running out of artillery as well.
It's certainly not looking very good for the Russians. And the best part is that it seems that it's just going to get worse. Because when you attack something like an oil refinery, there's not necessarily more parts. Actually, in fact, I just read that the attacks within Razan on the oil refinery there were substantial. Because not only did that more than half the amount of production from that plant, but it caused the entire price of diesel to go up across Russia. In fact, now Russians are paying more than even Americans for diesel. But it goes beyond that. Is that, keep in mind, 70% of all military transport is by train. And Russian trains very often are using diesel. This means that the attack in Razan on the oil refinery, it's more than just economic attacks. These, in fact, attacks will make it harder for Russia to transport its soldiers, to transport its military. And all of this is just going to make it harder and harder for the Kremlin to keep waging war. Have you noticed that as well?
Well, we often hear analysts speaking of, Russia's summer offensive. Well, I'm fond of quoting these statistics because they will really give a tanky pause. During the period of this summer offensive, Russia has lost 230,000 casualties, and they have gained 1/4% of Ukraine's total landmass. Now, they have advanced, a kilometer here, 400 meters here. Ukraine is very good about looking at the zero line and giving way to the least advantageous material, terrain. If you want to advance up a valley overlooked by hillsides, Ukraine is going to let you do it because they'll punish you for your success. But this war is not working out for Vladimir Putin. It simply isn't. He is not serious about peace. We see this with these attacks on ambulances in Kherson, attacking the train station in Zaporizhzhia. He aims for civilians, the drone attacks that Kyiv has had to endure. He isn't serious about peace. So I think Ukraine and the United States and Europe, we have to be serious about victory because that is the only path to future prosperity for Ukraine, is to defeat the Russian army in the field.
Well, I fully agree with you, of course. The fact is, Vladimir Putin at this point is in a very difficult position. And it's incredible enough is that when you read the Western press, they always talk about the Russians are making steady gains. But that ignores the fact that we're talking less than 1/4% costing tens of thousands of lives. I wouldn't argue that's really a gain. I'd say that's a great loss. And when you consider the fact that Ukraine is simply trying to not fight that kind of war, it's trying to bring the war to Russia on Russian territory. Then how's that quantified? How can we argue that it's not Ukraine who has consistently shown they can continue to advance? It's not just about taking back some mud fields. It's about who is going to prevail. And at this point, for Russia to prevail becomes harder and harder. Just look what's happened in the past few weeks within Russia. We've seen the arrest of multiple governors, the former governor of Kursk, of Belgorod. We have seen the former transport minister, who was from Belgorod, who killed himself and then a couple hours later had to resign from his position or was fired by Putin as a transport minister. Just days later, his former job as being in charge of not just transport, but also the ports of Russia was given over to the FSB. So what's really going on there? It seems that the FSB is trying to consolidate their own power in the country while simultaneously shaking down anything that could still make money. There's simply less ability for the FSB to make money as it had before. Because as you know, the FSB is, well, a mafia. And Vladimir Putin is the don of that mafia, which is why he's got a unique pressure. Because it's not just that there's repressions within the military. It's not that more than 100 officials just in the recent period have been arrested. That's more than any other point in decades. It's simply that there is more and more signs that there's strain, there's tumult within the Kremlin, that there's more and more pressure on Vladimir Putin, which is why I think that these peace talks coming up supposedly in the near future in Alaska are so important. Right now, Vladimir Putin doesn't have a lot of cards to play. But more than that, Vladimir Putin tries to project strength, tries to project that things are going well, but absolutely everybody sees what is actually happening. What do you think?
No, I have no idea what will come out of this Alaska summit. You pointed out that Putin is eating up his oligarchs and eating up his ministers, replacing their portfolios with FSB officers. This implies to me that Putin has run out of people to trust. Right? He is only trusting serving FSB officers. He himself is a KGB guy. I see his little world constricting. And as you pointed out, look, the FSB is not going to run an organization or a ministry for the good of the country. They're not doing this for God and country. They're doing this for this. And that's how that whole system runs. So it will be very interesting to me. Talking before the show, you brought up some very interesting points. I'd like to ask you, you don't even think Putin might even show up to Alaska. Why don't you fill us in on that?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that Vladimir Putin will not show up to Alaska himself, and he very well could use a body double. And the rationale for that's not just conspiracy theory, but something different. So there's been several defectors from the FSO. The FSO is like the secret service for the Russians. And those defectors have said a lot of things that are very similar. One is that Vladimir Putin does not like to fly. In fact, he virtually never flies. And that's because he's afraid of being assassinated. So very often they'll announce something like that Vladimir Putin will arrive at a certain date at a certain air time, and they'll notify all airports. So all airports have to be ready, but nobody knows to which he will arrive. But then he'll show up by boat. He doesn't come by air at all because they simply want to confuse people. Now, to fly to Alaska has very clear inherent risk. It would be a very limited number of airports to which you could fly, which means that he would be afraid that somebody with Stinger missiles could be waiting for him to go into final descent. There's a lot that could go wrong. And more than that, Vladimir Putin is extremely risk adverse. There's been a lot of people who have looked into this already. For instance, TBN, which is Japan's national broadcaster, looked in specifically at using facial recognition software to see if it is in fact Vladimir Putin who appears to all public events. And looking across several different events, they said, no, it's clearly not the same person. In fact, in some cases, it's only a 15% similarity. And to be clear, this facial recognition, it's the same brand as the ones that they use in the airports and used by the police. So this is not just some sort of a random company. But more than that, they also tested audio files, looking at how he said specific words. And what they found is that it's very clearly not the same person speaking in public. And incredibly enough, the think tank attached to the Ministry of Defense of Japan, they were asked about this. And they said, based upon all standards of identification, it is not the same person attending these events. And that actually makes a lot of sense, because in the eyes of Vladimir Putin, all of this is just for show. He doesn't really believe in the necessity of these formalities, let's call them, where he would go to an event to go meet with someone. Why would he expose himself to that risk? He could be poisoned. He could be arrested. He could be shot down. These are things that all no longer is it within his comfort zone. Within Russia itself, we know that he travels often by train in secret compartmentalized trains that nobody knows what is being transported. We know that throughout Russia, he has multiple offices that look exactly the same, with no natural light, only artificial light. So any time of day or night, he can say that he's in whatever location at that time of day. At the same time, we know that even when he traveled to places that are friendly, Astana, Kazakhstan, for instance, they apparently, according to his former bodyguards, refitted the embassy to become a bomb shelter in case it was bombed, not just attacked, but actively bombed, with its own internal communication system that had nothing to do with the local Kazakh infrastructure. And if he does that already just in Kazakhstan, why would he take more risks to travel to the United States, a country which he believes is already at war with him? I think it's highly improbable that we'll see Vladimir Putin traveling ever again to the United States. What do you think?
Well, and all that being said, we don't know how the talks in Alaska are going to go, but I can see some impediments to progress. One of them is not including President Zelensky in the negotiated settlement of a war that he is fighting for survival. Secondly, Vladimir Putin has made clear his maximalist demands, and they're not going to float. President Zelensky has said, "We are not trading you the territory you stole for peace and security." That's a total non-starter. I'm frankly surprised that President Trump is actually going to take a flight to Alaska and stand there and wind up with whatever doo-doo sandwich they serve at this meeting. I don't see any progress. I only see political risk for Washington, and we all know what Putin is going to say. We all know this. And I do agree with you that Putin is very risk averse. He senses clear and present dangers to himself. There have been. You and I covered the mutiny at length. And who knows? The world and his own people and his oligarchs, those that are still alive, have not forgotten that this war was his idea. This was a 72-hour in and out and then a victory parade in Kyiv. Well, it hasn't worked out that way. They'll have lost more men than they have lost in all of their world wars combined since World War II. And they are well above 1 million casualties. They're sustaining 300,000 or 400,000 casualties per year. And frankly, I see Ukraine can keep fighting for a very long time, fighting smart, fighting on the defensive, and making Russia pay for every millimeter in a gallon of blood.
Absolutely the case. It does not look like it's going to get any better for the Putin regime soon. Chuck, it was great talking with you today.
Good to talk to you, Jason.